Have you used a parallel text in your language classroom? Maybe this is a new concept to you, like it was to me, or maybe you could use some new ways of going about it. But either way, stick around because in this episode, we're talking about using parallel text. I'm joined by Kaitlin Leppert, who's a Spanish teacher in Wisconsin, and she has lots of experience to share around this effective teaching procedure. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and of course, I have to start by saying thank you for being here. Because again, you are a teacher, and you are probably not sitting in your classroom right now, and you're listening to a podcast about teaching. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, driving in the car, folding laundry, going for a run, you're choosing to use that time to reflect on your teaching. And thank you so much for doing that. It's what makes you an incredible educator. So today, we're going to give you some ways of looking at your teaching in yet a different way. Maybe try something out that you haven't before. And we're going to be talking about this idea of parallel texts and not just the benefits of using them, but how to actually do that. And to help us grapple with this whole idea and figure out how we're going to do it in the classroom is Kaitlin Leppert. And you may be familiar with her because she has a podcast of her own, which is called Preaching to a Choir. And she is a Spanish teacher in Wisconsin, and she's been teaching for about 11 years. Maybe from ACTFL you would know her, or from being at CI Midwest, or also a member and presenting at her state organization at WAFLT in Wisconsin. Another shout out to a state organization. You know, I love to do that. So I think I hopefully did you justice talking about who you are, Kaitlin. So if I missed anything, feel free to say that. But thank you so much for being with me today on the podcast.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. You definitely did me justice. The only thing that we left off that is important that everyone knows is how much of a cat lover I am.
Oh,
But
okay.
as far as the language experience goes, you nailed it. So thank you for that warm welcome.
Okay. So let's jump into this idea of parallel texts. And I have to say, I have had a couple of conversations recently where this idea has come up in talking about the idea of acquisition-driven instruction, that I'm hearing it a little more often. So when I saw that you have presented on this and have some great experience with it, I wanted to reach out to you so that, as I usually do, I wanted to learn more about it. And so I have my opportunity, and then why not share it out with other teachers as well? So what is a parallel text, and why should teachers consider using them?
Yeah, so I first want to start by saying this idea isn't necessarily mine, but as we often share in this community, I came across the idea of parallel stories, which is basically taking a story that was written and changing some details, but it still kind of retains its original form. And then I thought to myself, why does it have to just be a story? And so I decided that I could start to implement it with description text, descriptions of people, biographies, obviously stories, informational pieces, anything that would be able to give students input, repetition, those things that they need for acquisition, but that could fit into what we're talking about in class, not just stories.
Okay, so this is something that you are writing based on the topic or theme that you're doing within a unit?
Yes, absolutely. So, for example, right now in my fifth grade class, we are using Señor Woolley's Billy y las Botas. And so when we do a parallel text, it's going to be based off of that storyline.
Mm-hmm. So when did you first encounter this, and what kind of sparked you to think, oh, let me give this a try?
Well, sometimes I have classes, and I'm sure our listeners also have experienced this, that the normal things that you try to do just don't work, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe they have too much energy to handle some of the activities that you like to do. And so I was trying to find lower key ways that I could provide them with input and with a little bit of flexibility and fun that isn't going to make us all go a little crazy.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the different ways of engaging students in a parallel text. So let's start by, creating that original text that I guess you're starting by writing. And this is very new to me. So maybe I'm going to ask what might seem like obvious questions a little bit, but I just want to make sure that I'm truly understanding it. So, what's a theme where you have used a parallel text?
So I have done parallel text before when we're writing biographies and describing people.
Okay. So are you then starting with the text that eventually students would be producing on their own? So it's kind of starting as a model for them?
So I think there's a lot of ways, and I know that we're trying to break this down in a way that is kind of easy to take baby steps, but
Mhm.
I also want to show people how versatile things can be. There have been times where I have given students a text, a short text, maybe it is a biography of somebody that I just want them to look at, understand, that's very easy, and also maybe then they can write their own biography by using that same frame that I've provided. They
Mhm.
swap out the names, the adjectives, the details. But if you are able to implement the strategy right and discuss in your class, that original text can come from the class text that you create. So you're not
Mhm.
doing extra work on your own, which is
Mhm.
making our lives easier and maximizing our time and energy. So I really recommend if you can implement write and discuss like the day before or earlier in the week, then you have a text that you can pull from or you can add to and beef up that you can
Mhm.
bring back to do a separate parallel text activity with students.
Mhm. So I recently did a podcast episode with Ben Fisher, who's in Washington
Yes.
State, and we talked all about write and discuss. And
Yay!
he brought up parallel text as something you can do with it. And I remember thinking, oh, I can't wait for 3 days because I'm going to find out about parallel text when I talk to Kaitlin Leppert. So
Yes.
it's like it's all kind of coming together right now. So that's that idea of the text in that case, if you're doing a write and discuss, the text is co-created by the students and the teacher together rather than the teacher writing it ahead of time.
Yes, and that way you know it's super comprehensible because they were part of that creation process.
Okay. So we have the text, whether it has been created by the teacher, written by the teacher, or co created with the students. So once we have that, let's talk about what we're doing with that in the classroom.
Yeah, so before you want to give your students a chance to be super creative on their own, I highly recommend kind of doing a whole class activity with it. And so a lot of times I will take that text and I use a document camera, but you could project it or have it on a smart board. And as a class, I just tell them, hey, we're going to turn this into something new. We're going to make this our own. So we're going to go through this story. And I've done this with, I do this with, a lot with Senior Woolley stories in class because there's so much creativity and to work with. And so I'll say, okay, this character's name is not Bo. What's the character's name going to be? And you can lead this in the target language.
Mhm.
And so they'll shout out ideas or they'll raise their hands. And I'll be like, he doesn't live with his family. What does he live with? And they'll be like, his cats. And so, like, as a whole class, we're kind of, it's almost write and discuss 2.0,
Mhm.
where we're as a class co creating a parallel text that we're just changing those details, but nothing big. I really avoid the verbs and I pull out the things that I know students are familiar with. So oftentimes we'll change adjectives or nouns or names or ages, some of those more simpler things where it gives it enough creativity and uniqueness, but it's not going to have them chasing, this I don't know how to say this and I don't know how to put this into words and coming up with these ideas they don't have the language for.
Okay. So when they're looking at this text, when you're either projecting it or maybe even wrote it on the board, are you then highlighting the parts that you are going to leave open the option for changing? Or are you just kind of deleting them and saying, what are we going to put in there? Like physically, what are the students seeing when you are swapping out, to use the word that you used?
So most of the time I do this very low tech with my document camera, and I will think about the level of my students. And a lot of times I do this with my younger students because it's kind of scaffolding their ability to create their own texts and stories. And so I will choose which things we come up to. But I
Hmm.
actually, since you asked about it, I
Hmm.
actually have in my plans for next week to do this with my sixth grade using Guapo by Senior Woolley. And we're actually going to do it where there's blanks already kind of selected for them. So, depending on what you think your class or you can handle, if you're going to try this the first time, you may want to go through and kind of pre select
Hmm.
specific things you want to change just to get your toes in it a little bit.
Hmm. And when you say the blanks are there, so they're not seeing a version where those blanks are already filled in with some sort of content and then they're swapping out. So they're actually essentially kind of co-creating the story together by adding in the blanks, almost like a Mad Lib. Or am I thinking
Well,
about that wrong?
no, no, no. So that's my new spin on it. So I've done it
Okay.
both ways. A lot of times I have the text straight up and I'll just literally cross off the words. But I decided to test it out. And if this is a terrible experience on Monday with my sixth graders, I'll respond on social media and let everyone know. But I thought that it could be a really fun way to kind of introduce them to some content
Hmm.
by getting their creativity sparked because I don't want them to know the story yet.
Hmm.
So I think it depends kind of on your intent and how you're going to use it because I've used parallel text to introduce new stories, and
Hmm.
I've also used them as a way to kind of recap the content we've been doing in class. So
Hmm.
I think depending on where you want to use it in kind of your sequence of lessons of your story or of your topic,
Hmm.
that can change the situation.
Hmm. And as you're doing that, and it depends on the level of the students, not necessarily their proficiency level, but even their developmental level. But do you ever focus on the parts of speech?
Not in a way where we're thinking about uh, like this is a verb, this is a noun, but I will oftentimes when I decide to kind of go that route, and this gets more into when I let students kind of work more on their own
Hmm.
because they need more specific parameters when they're creating their own parallel text. So I will highlight, for example, in a digital document of a story, I will highlight if I'm suggesting they change maybe adjectives, I'll highlight all the adjectives in pink and then I'll give them kind of a glossary bank of words to choose from to swap it in and out of. I'll
Hmm.
highlight the food orange and list those there. But I don't necessarily, focus so much on the parts of speech because and I'm not sure about you, but my students in middle school oftentimes even still struggle with that in their first language. And
Right.
so I try to make it when I'm giving them those specific things, I make it more student friendly in the wording.
And you had mentioned in there the idea when they're creating their own. Can you tell us a little bit more about that when they're creating their own text?
Yes, so I decided to kind of start implementing this as a stepping stone in order to allow students the opportunity to be creative and create their own stories without having this temptation to translate things or say things they don't know how to say. And so I recommend doing an example as a whole class first so everyone can kind of be on the same page. And you could stop there. You don't need to go on to students creating on their own or in partners. But if you want to give them that opportunity, having them have a parallel text to work from and maybe specifically saying or underlining these are the different details you can change
Hmm.
and then they're able to change it, make it their own. And I've even had students illustrate storybooks before. I've had them kind of act it out. I've read them to the class. There's a lot of
Hmm.
ways then you can recycle it and it's new enough that it piques their interest, but it's similar enough and repetitive enough that they understand it.
And what is the recommended length? I'm just essentially asking, based on your own experience of what has worked well with students, what length or number of sentences for telling the story works well?
Generally speaking, I would think if you're doing a story, I might have a little bit longer, like maybe two paragraphs, maybe 10 sentences or so. mm, Because I think, you need enough content there to tell the story. But if you're doing even just like a description of a place or a person or something that's a little less free, I would say maybe a paragraph, 5 to 7 sentences or so. You don't want to overwhelm them with text.
Do you have a place where you pull your ideas for these stories from?
So oftentimes when I'm doing stories, it's mostly Senior Woolley. I get so much inspiration from there. And a lot of times I will just see what's happening in the story and type up a summary for myself. But it's usually what we're working on in our classes that it'll come from.
And have you used them in a way, again, I'm thinking now about like my own classroom. How could I use this? So this is where these questions start to come from, where you start with a story, you do the parallel text and they're swapping out and learning probably maybe some words along the way and structures. Do you build on that story or do you start a new one as they've gone on to other topics? Can you make the story longer and build on it, or are you starting with new stories as you go?
Generally speaking, if I've had them kind of go through this whole process of we've done one as a class and now they're creating on their own, usually that's the culminating
Mhm,
activity for me of that type of unit, so to speak. But I often will use a strategy called right inside the story that I
mhm.
learned from Tina Hargaden. Are you familiar with it?
I'm not, so
Okay,
let's talk about
awesome.
that.
Yes,
Right
so
inside the story, you
right
said?
inside the story. And
Mhm,
I absolutely love this strategy to help students learn how to add more detail into their writing and to beef it up. So you could take one of these texts that a student had written or a group had written, or even the one you decided as a class and come back to it the next day and kind of like co-creating a text like a write and discuss, look at it
mhm,
as a whole group and say, let's look at this first couple of sentences. Are there any extra details we could add? Are there any additional changes we want to make? Wait, we said that this character is sad. Maybe we should add a sentence that says why they're sad. And it's a way to kind of get them to add depth to their writing too. So you
mhm.
could do that, but oftentimes it's a culminating activity for me.
And what are some things that you've done once they have their new text, whether you've created it as a class, whether they've done it individually? So now they have this text that's pretty much almost entirely comprehensible to them. So what are some extension activities of what you can then do with that text with students?
So one of the things that I did last year was they turned them into actual storybooks that I then they illustrated them and everything, and now they're in my classroom library
Mhm.
and they are super popular with all of the classes during free choice reading time. We've done storyboards, so I might take one of theirs and, type it up and then the class has to illustrate it. Sometimes I'll take their ideas and I'll do like a oops, Miss Leppert, when she typed up our story, a lot of these details were wrong. Like, and
Mhm.
so almost kind of having them recall the original story and
Mhm.
having to go back through and be like, no, the kid's name is not George, it's Bob, or whatever it is.
Mhm.
But a lot of times I like to have them turn it into something that they can show off and can live in our
Mhm.
classroom.
This is going to be a in a CI classroom, we don't ask these questions kind of question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Oh.
But it's a question about accuracy.
Mhm.
And there's always this idea that, oh, well, if you're totally in on you're a CI classroom, that we don't talk about grammar or anything like that. But we are always working towards increased accuracy of language. You know, it has to have a certain level of accuracy to be understood as you're producing your output. So, where does accuracy come in as they are swapping out elements of the story? So, I'm looking at something specific like an adjective. So, if you teach a language where the adjective has to have the same form as the noun, has to agree in number or gender or whatever, so, how are you working with students so that when they add in a new adjective, if that's what they're swapping out, that it remains or they're following the correct form of it?
Yes. Well, I appreciate
Okay.
this question because for people who maybe have heard me talk a lot before, they know I live in the gray area of all of this. And so these are things I like to talk about.
Good.
But even if they get me in trouble. But
Mhm.
As
So
far as
can I
that,
just say the fact that we have this language teaching community, it's like if you talk about grammar and if you talk about CI, that there's the divide. And it's why I love so much the Florencia Henshaw book and Maris Hawkins' book, The Common Ground. It's like, can we please just come together and just all get along and not
yes,
feel like, oh my gosh, she said grammar. This is
yes,
like, let's move past that. Let's all live in the gray area. So
absolutely,
let's so let's
100%.
so take us there. Take us to the common ground gray area.
Oh dear, now I feel pressure. No. So a lot of times, depending on how much work you want to put in advance into preparing a resource for your students to create their version of the text, I will, if I'm able to, now all texts don't lend themselves well to this, but I will actually, when I create a little glossary of options for them to pick from, like if I am saying you can swap out this adjective and I know that it's describing Billy La Bufanda, Billy the Scarf, for those of you that don't speak Spanish, who's a Signoroli character, I will put the adjective into the form that it needs to be in when they're going to swap it in. If
Hmm.
students are doing it a little bit more freestyle, before something ends up in my classroom library, I will have them come up to me and show it to me, either typed out or written out on paper, and I will talk through those things with them. So I'll just say, oh, this adjective actually needs to have an A at the end, and that's because we're describing this person. And I pretty
Hmm.
much leave it at that. I don't get into it more, but they hear that from me. I have them 4 years in a row. They hear it
Hmm.
from me over and over and over again. And by the time they hit eighth grade, they're like, oh, yeah, we need to do that because of this. And
Hmm.
so, but if we're just doing it and it's not going to be read by other students, if I'm going to maybe read it to the class or I'm going to type it up, I don't worry about it as long as the meaning is there.
There is a school of thought or research school within language acquisition that looks at all language as lexical, that it's not actually structures, it's just every single individual word is just a lexical piece, so that like the word rojo is different. It's a different lexical piece than roja. It's different than rojos. It's different than rojas. So providing that sort of word bank that
Hmm.
it's the one that works in there, and
Yep.
again, I don't know that I totally agree with that completely, but it is just a different spin and looking at it that you don't like put it in the right form. I love that. That was like the perfect answer that I needed for when I'm trying this, is to give them the choices that are already in the right form so that they're always going to use it in the right form, because that's kind of the level that they're at,
Yes.
unless they're at a higher proficiency level
Hmm.
where that accuracy is going to play in. So I
Right.
appreciate that.
Sure.
So I would like to know, just example wise, you had mentioned earlier, like if you're doing a parallel text about the like personal descriptions, I believe you said at the beginning, but could you talk us through a story that you've done that was outside of that just so we can get an idea of, oh, that's the type of story you're talking about when you're doing a parallel text.
Yes. So one of the examples that I did last year with the sixth grade that they turned into classroom storybooks was based off of the short film The Gift, El Regalo.
Hmm.
Have you seen that
Hmm.
one?
Hmm. I have,
And
yes.
and listeners, if you haven't seen it, it's a really good one. I highly recommend you use it for like a clip chat. And so we had done that as a clip chat in class and we had worked with that and we came together as a write and discuss activity and we wrote a summary of that story. So, there is a boy, he's playing video games, his mom comes into the house, she has a box, inside the box there's a puppy, the boy is frustrated, and we went through just kind of in maybe 2 paragraphs or less the main things that happened in that story. And so then, when it was time for students to do their own version of the story, they changed what was in the box, what was the present, how were they feeling, and even at the ending, some of them made. One of the students, they made their story about an extraterrestrial, that the
Hmm.
main character is an alien now, and inside the box was a rock, a pet rock.
Hmm.
But it's okay because they were friends at the end, and it all worked out.
So you've had a ton of experience with this, which it's why I love having this conversation with you. So, what are some of your pro tips that you've learned? It's it's funny that sometimes do this is great, but then the don't do this, I've tried this and it didn't work well for me. So let me give you a hint here. So, what are some pro tips?
Yeah, a lot of the advice that I've already shared, I learned the hard way, specifically with modeling a parallel text and what you want them to do as a whole class first. I I highly recommend that even if you want your students to create their own or work in partners, that before you get to that point or even tell them you're going to let them do that, that you as a whole class decide a version together so they know exactly what to expect.
Hmm.
And if you have a class that you're worried their creativity is going to run them off of a cliff because they want to change the whole story and not just change the details, that you limit them to, like I said, providing them with options that they can swap in or out, or providing them with a limit of how many words they can ask you for or that they can look up. So, a
Hmm.
lot of times when I'm having my students do creative things, I'll say, you need to use the Spanish you know, you need to use the Spanish that, we've used in class, but I will look up or I will help you with up to 5 words or 3 words
Hmm.
because they'd have a hard time simplifying their ideas into comprehensible language on their own.
I like the idea of the word bank one because it will provide the accurate forms to use as they're
Mm-hmm.
swapping out, but also it helps to rein in some of those things that can go off the tracks a little bit. And we've all been there,
Yes.
and it's sort of like, how do I get the train back on
Oh
the
yeah.
track?
I mean, when I was doing this with El Realo last year with the 6th grade, I had them come, one group come show me their story, and I was like, this isn't even anything close to the original story that we talked about. Like, what are you doing? They're like, well, we wanted it to be about a boy and a girl, and they break up. And I'm like, no, it needs to be similar enough to
Right.
what happened. You're changing the details, not the whole
Hmm.
story.
Yes. Wow. So you're clearly passionate about a lot of these CI terms, like, and practices. You're talking about write and discuss, you're doing the parallel text, you're doing the write inside the story, like all these different things. You mentioned clip chat, there's like all this stuff. I'm like, wow, she's living this stuff like every day in her classroom. I love to hear it. So what is continuing to inspire you as you continue on this teaching journey?
So I would say probably about 6 years ago, I had been teaching with a textbook and I had been teaching very traditionally, and my students were not successful in my class, and I was feeling burnt out and was not enjoying my class, and I was frustrated, and I was like, what is wrong with this? Something's got to give. This isn't working. And so I started to Google different ways to practice different ideas in Spanish because I didn't learn about any of this when I was in college and I wasn't taught this way either. And so when I went down that rabbit hole, I discovered the Comprehensible Classroom website, Martina Beck's and Somos, and kind of dabbled in here and there. And from there, I couldn't get enough of this information. And so I found all the different Facebook groups, CI Liftoff, IFLT, the Somos group, the Senior Woology group, and all of these groups. And I was like, wow, there's a whole community of teachers out here that had the same struggle as me. A lot of them have, and are working to find a better way. There is a better way, and we're working to make it work for us.
Hmm.
And so I think just in general, the community of teachers that are willing to put themselves out there, that are willing to be vulnerable and say, oh, I may have had 20 years of experience, but I've noticed that my practice isn't working or my students aren't able to use the language like I want them to. And they're willing to ask questions, share ideas. And so on Twitter, I'm in, Lane Chat a lot and on social media and just those conversations with other teachers. I could list 100 specific names,
Hmm.
but I think just the idea that all these people are coming together in their free time, like you mentioned at the beginning of the
Hmm.
episode,
Hmm.
taking their time they're not getting paid for to talk about teaching, to do better for themselves and for their students is what continues to inspire me and why I started sharing in the first place and why I keep sharing now.
Yes, and thank you for doing that. And I'm always just I'm not as amazed anymore because it's more commonplace, but language teachers are just generous. It's amazing to me the amount of stuff that gets shared out, and the internet makes for this ability to just share out easy. And so it's great that we have that opportunity and so much is happening. So this is the point where I would like to pull the teacher curtain back a little bit and get to know Kaitlin. So you ready to play this little game of this or that?
Yes,
All
bring it
right.
on.
Okay. So just choose one, and if you'd like to say just a little bit why, we can maybe learn a little bit about you. Okay, so here's the first one. If you're going on a trip at least a week, are you going to pack lightly? Are you throwing everything in that suitcase?
Oh, I'm packing lightly. I just experienced this. I went to London for a week at the end of October, and I don't want to lose my luggage. And I also want to be able to have the flexibility to move around where I want at my destination and not be trapped by a suitcase.
Okay. All right. See, right there. Clear cut. Absolutely. There we go. Now we know you went to London, so that's great. What were you doing in London? Just hanging out or?
No, actually, one of my favorite singers, her name is Anastasia. She's from the States, but never made it here. She's super popular in Europe, and I hadn't seen her in 20 years, so I decided to take the trip over to see her on tour.
There you go. Wow. Great. Okay. So now when it comes to reading, regardless of what it might be, are you sticking to paper books or have you moved on to the world of electronic ebooks, all of that?
I have moved on to the Kindle. It's
Uh-huh.
just such a convenient way for me to have so many different kinds of text at my fingertips. And so if I get bored with a book, I'm a firm believer, and I tell my students this too. Sorry, oh, teacher hat. Let me take it off again. That I'm not going to waste my time reading a bad book. So I love being able to have different titles at my fingertips.
Hmm.
But it's got to be the paper white for my eyes
Okay.
and the light. I don't want like
Uh-huh.
the bright. Mm-mm.
Absolutely. Okay, and the last one, this is about music, songs. If you hear a song come on, I don't know, we don't listen to the radio so much anymore, but you hear a song somewhere, and are you going to know the words or are you just going to fake it in a way that makes people think you know the words?
Uh, if I'm going to sing along, I'm going to know the words. Otherwise,
Okay.
I will not be doing that. But for some reason, as many people can probably agree with, lyrics just stick in my brain, and I don't know where they
Yeah.
come from when they come out of me.
Okay.
So,
Okay. All right. So you are an ebook reading, travel the world to see your favorite singer, lightly, traveling lightly to see your favorite singer, and you are really good with song lyrics. See, we've
yes,
learned all about that. It's funny, none of that came up in talking about parallel text. Shocking.
it did not.
But you could write a story, right, about your trip and packing lightly. You
I
could always.
absolutely could. And I definitely pull those things into my classroom. I take pictures, I do picture talks. When I give them assessments, I always tell them about my own fears and experiences and preferences. So, absolutely.
Excellent. So I'm sure that there are teachers listening to us right now that would like to connect with you to maybe talk more about parallel text, see some examples of what you're doing, follow you on social media. So where can teachers connect with you?
Yes, so there's a lot of different places teachers can connect with me. So I post when I can, but I love to connect with you all. So on Facebook, Preaching to Acquire, like acquisition acquire,
Mm-hmm.
and Instagram, also Preaching to Acquire. Twitter, you can find me at Kaitlin Leppert. And I also have my podcast, Preaching to Acquire, which I would love for you to check out and take a listen to if you're able to.
Okay, excellent. I will make sure all of that is in the show notes so that teachers can be reaching out to you. And before we say goodbye, I like to leave teachers with some actionable advice. Maybe they have dabbled in parallel texts or any of these CI activities that you've talked about. But what's some kind of actionable tips or advice that you could give those teachers as they're contemplating, jumping into this?
So I would say that the simplest way to kind of try this out would be look at what you're talking about in your class now or what's upcoming and do a type up a paragraph about the story or the lesson that you've had and do an example together in class. Don't even worry about trying to set kids off on their own. But hey, we're just going to do a fun activity today where we're going to take this story, we're going to switch it up and make it our own. We can make it wild and goofy and silly, but that will get them exposed to it. It'll let you try it, but not in a way that's super high stress or high stakes.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you for that. And it's also going to be sort of priming students for doing it on their own when they're seeing that model that way. So, this was a new concept to me, and I got exactly what I wanted out of this conversation. I have a very clear idea of what it is, and I'm excited to try it out in my classroom, as are many teachers listening to us right now. So, thank you so much, Kaitlin, for sharing all of your insights with us today.
You are so welcome. It was my pleasure.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Kaitlin Leppert? I know that I'm ready to take on a parallel text activity with my students based on all of her useful insights and suggestions. So be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Kaitlin. You'll also see a link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter, which has tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you'd like to work together, either in person in your school or remotely. Talk to you soon. Bye for now. You've been listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss a single episode. Let's continue the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at WL Classroom. You can also see over 250 blog posts about language teaching at, you guessed it, WLClassroom.com.